Hello everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. In today's video, we'll follow James and Diep's journey of love, forgiveness, and justice. When Trung reveals that her father was the one behind Diep's suffering, everything changes. James insists that the law must punish those who caused harm, while Diep chooses to forgive. Despite their differences, James begins building a wooden house, a symbol of safety, hope, and a promise for their future together. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapters. This story explores the struggle between forgiveness and justice. Trang confesses to James that her father was the one responsible for harming Diep. Though Diep chooses forgiveness, James cannot accept letting the wrongdoers go unpunished. Determined to protect the woman he loves, James vows to bring Trang and her father to justice. At the same time, he begins building a wooden house surrounded by mango and cinnamon trees, a sanctuary for Diep, a place where she can heal and start anew. Their conversations reveal contrasting paths: Diep's gentle forgiveness and James's firm demand for accountability. As the house nears completion, it becomes more than a shelter. It symbolizes James's love and a promise of marriage. Together, James and Diep step into a future shaped by compassion, resilience, and the unyielding balance between mercy and justice. Beneath the soft glow of a single lamp, James sat hunched over the table, blueprints spread like a sea of possibilities. His fingers traced the neat lines of a wooden house design: 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a porch that opened into the fields. To anyone else, it was just paper, but to James, every detail carried a promise. He wanted this place to be more than a home. It was to be a sanctuary, a shelter for Diep, where the shadows of her past could no longer reach her. "Look here, Mom," James said, his tone hopeful but quiet. The veranda would face the east. Mornings will be full of light. His eyes softened as he spoke, already imagining Diep standing there, the breeze lifting her hair. His mother leaned closer, studying the blueprint, her voice gentle but firm. "It's a fine plan, son. But remember, this house isn't for you alone. You should ask Diep what she wants." James smiled faintly, though his heart felt heavy. He pictured the mango and cinnamon trees he would plant around the house, a living shield against the harsh world outside. Yet in the depths of his thoughts, fear gnawed at him. What if Diep rejected the idea? What if no house, no matter how carefully built, could erase the pain she carried? He flipped another page, pointing to the raised foundation. "We'll build it higher to avoid dampness. It's practical, but also safer." His voice faltered slightly, as though the foundation he truly wished to raise was not of wood, but of trust. His mother reached across the table, squeezing his hand, her eyes steady with conviction. "James, if your heart is true, she will feel it. Don't worry so much." He nodded, though unease lingered. For him, this house was more than timber and nails. It was an unspoken vow to guard Diep's future, no matter how broken the past remained. Days later, the pale glow of the office lamp cast long shadows as James faced Trang across the desk. She sat with her hands clasped tightly, her voice hesitant yet determined. "I'm leaving the company, James. I've decided to study abroad, financial management." Her words cut through the quiet, and James leaned back, taking them in. Admiration flickered in his eyes. Trang had been steadfast, hard-working, loyal. But beneath that respect, he felt a sting of loss. He forced a small smile. "Thank you for everything you've done here. Truly. I wish you success in whatever lies ahead." Memories surfaced. Long nights when Trang stood by his side, helping him carry the weight of endless projects. She had been more than just an assistant. She had been part of the heartbeat of the company. Without her, the halls would feel emptier. Trang's gaze shimmered, her voice soft. "Working here taught me so much. I'll do my best to live up to it." James rose and extended his hand. "If ever you wish to return, the door will always be open." Their hands met, a firm grip of trust and respect, though the moment felt like an ending. The sun dipped lower outside, painting the office in fading gold, as though marking the close of one chapter and the uncertain dawn of another. But that wasn't the last conversation between them. One evening, as the office dimmed into shadows, Trang sat across from James again, her face pale, her eyes brimming with dread. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "James, I need to tell you something. My father, he's the one behind what happened to Diep." The room fell into a suffocating silence. James froze, his breath catching in his chest. His voice emerged cold, heavy with suppressed rage. "Why?" Trang's tears streamed as she lowered her head. "I tried to stop him. I begged him to let it go, but he wouldn't listen. I swear, I never wanted this to happen." James's hands clenched into fists, his mind filled with images of Diep, her struggles, her quiet endurance, the pain etched in her eyes. Fury surged within him, dark and consuming. "Do you have any idea what Diep went through because of him?" His voice broke, torn between shouting and choking on grief. "Please," Trang pleaded, her voice cracking. "Don't take this further. Don't bring it to the law. It will destroy everything." But James shook his head, his expression unyielding. "Trang, I can forgive you for staying silent, but this isn't about forgiveness anymore. The law must decide. Justice must be done." His words cut like steel, final and irrevocable. Trang's body slumped, her face drained of color. The fragile hope she carried shattered. James turned away, the storm in his chest raging. He had once respected Trang, but Diep's pain weighed far heavier. As he walked out, leaving Trang behind in her despair, he felt the night pressing in around him. Shadows swallowed the last traces of light, mirroring the choice he carried. Justice, not mercy. That was his vow. The following afternoon, under the scorching sun, James stood with Duke in the open field. A tape measure stretched between them, marking the soil. Sweat ran down his brow, yet his voice was steady. 5 meters long, 6 wide. What do you think? Duke chuckled, shaking his head. Too big, James. 4 meters is enough. James's eyes narrowed, as if already picturing the wooden walls rising from the ground, forming a haven where Diep could begin anew. It has to be cozy, Duke. Not too grand, but not too small. I want it to feel safe. Duke glanced toward Diep's small chicken shed. That's about 3.5 meters wide. If you want simple, you should look at that for scale. James nodded, smiling faintly, though his heart felt the gravity of what he was doing. Each strike of the hammer he imagined was more than construction. It was redemption. a place where Diep's laughter might return. "Do you know anyone skilled with wooden houses?" he asked. "I'll find a team for you," Duke replied. As they marked the land, the breeze carried the scent of freshly tilled soil. James paused, gazing out at the shimmering horizon. This house was his gift, his pledge, yet beneath his determination, an ache remained. For Diep, for the innocence stolen from her, for the justice he vowed to deliver. Every stake he drove into the ground was a silent promise. She would not suffer alone again. A few days later, in a roadside cafe bathed in soft amber light, James and Diep sat facing each other. Condensation dripped down their glasses of lemon tea. "I know the truth now," Diep said softly. Her eyes lingered on the table. "I know who caused all of this. They've apologized. Should I forgive them?" James stiffened, his grip tightening around his glass. His jaw clenched as an inner storm brewed. "Diep, forgiveness is noble. But justice," his voice dropped, edged with steel. "Justice cannot be ignored. People must answer for what they've done." Diep's gaze lifted, gentle yet unwavering. "I can forgive, James. My heart can let go, but I will not forget." The cafe fell quiet, the air between them heavy. James studied her, his heart aching. She was too kind, perhaps dangerously so. "Diep, don't be soft to the point of harm. We forgive to move on, but we must still protect ourselves." She offered a faint smile, her eyes glinting like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Forgiveness gives me peace, James. It doesn't mean I'm blind." He sighed, raising his glass as though to toast. "Then let this be the start of something new. But remember, while you forgive, I will ensure the law brings justice. That's my promise to you." The hum of the cafe faded into the background, leaving only their shared silence, fragile yet resolute. Between them lay a bridge of compassion and truth, thin but unbreakable. James's thoughts lingered on the house he was building. Soon, Diep would step into it, and maybe then, surrounded by safety and care, her scars would begin to heal. The following week, construction began. Wooden beams arrived on carts, pulled by oxen, the smell of fresh timber filling the air. James stood at the edge of the lot, sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with dirt and sweat. Duke barked directions at the workers, measuring, sawing, hammering, as the structure slowly rose from the earth. James's gaze never wavered. Each nail driven in was a heartbeat closer to his promise. He watched the framework climb skyward, the skeleton of a dream turning solid. Duke came to his side, wiping sweat with the back of his arm. "You're working harder than the builders, James. What's driving you this much?" James's eyes narrowed, his voice steady but laced with conviction. "I want her to have a home where fear can't reach. A place where every corner speaks safety." Duke nodded thoughtfully, but he also knew what weighed in James's heart: justice. For Diep, this house was healing. For James, it was also proof that he could protect her from anyone, even the ghosts of betrayal. Late one evening, when the workers had gone, James stayed behind. Lantern in hand, he walked through the half-finished structure, imagining how it would feel when complete. He touched the beams, rough under his fingers, whispering silently as though the house could hear him. "This is where she'll smile." This is where she'll rest. No one will hurt her here. He stepped into what would become the bedroom. In his mind, Diep's laughter echoed faintly, children's footsteps scattering across the floorboards. The vision pulled at his chest, both a hope and a burden. A breeze swept through the open frame, carrying with it the scent of wet earth. James paused, gazing out at the dark field. In that moment, he thought again of Trang's confession, the weight of betrayal, the shadow of her father's crime. Anger welled up, sharp as a blade, but he steadied himself. He couldn't let fury consume him. Justice would come, but it would come through the law, not vengeance. He closed his eyes, pressing his palm against the beam. For Diep, he whispered. Everything for her. Meanwhile, Diep sat under the veranda of her old cottage, the soft hum of crickets filling the night. Trang approached quietly, her face pale, her movements uncertain. Diep, Trang called softly. Diep looked up, surprise flickering across her face. She hadn't seen Trang since the truth had surfaced. Trang's voice trembled. I don't expect forgiveness. I had to say it. I never wanted to hurt you. It was my father's doing. I tried to stop him. Diep's heart clenched. Pain welled up, but her gaze remained calm, steady. Trang, I don't hate you. Carrying hatred only adds weight to the pain I already have. Tears spilled down Trang's cheeks. She dropped to her knees, voice cracking. You're kinder than I deserve. Diep reached out, lifting her gently by the arms. Don't kneel. What's done is done. But kindness is not weakness, Trang. It doesn't erase what happened. Their eyes met. Trang's drowning in guilt, Diep's shining with a quiet strength. Live differently from now on, Diep said. That's the only way forgiveness means something. Trang sobbed, nodding, as though those words carved a path she could finally walk. Days passed, and the wooden house neared completion. The walls stood firm, the roof tiles gleamed beneath the sun, and the scent of fresh timber lingered like hope itself. James watched as workers placed the final beams, his chest swelling with pride. One evening, he brought Diep to the site. The sunset stretched long shadows across the land as they stood at the threshold of the almost finished home. James, is this for me? Diep asked, her voice hushed, almost afraid to believe it. James nodded, his tone firm yet tender. Yes, for you, for us. This is where our new life begins. Diep stepped inside, her eyes roaming the space, fingers brushing against the smooth wooden walls. She paused, taking in the small windows, the simple yet warm design. It's beautiful, she whispered, her voice breaking. James studied her expression, searching for any hesitation. I want this to be your safe place, Diep. A place where you can breathe, laugh, and dream again. Her eyes glistened with tears as she turned to him. James, you've already given me more than I ever imagined. A home, safety, kindness. I don't know if I can repay that. He stepped closer, his voice low, filled with emotion. You don't need to repay me. Just let me be by your side. That's all I ask. Diep lowered her gaze, overwhelmed, but the tears that slipped down her cheeks spoke louder than words. Later that night, James sat with his mother once more, lantern light flickering over their faces. He shared with her what Diep had said, how her quiet tears carried gratitude. His mother's eyes softened, pride warming her expression. She's been through so much, and yet she still forgives. That kind of strength is rare. James nodded, his voice solemn. She forgives, but I cannot. Not in the way she does. For what they did to her, the law must answer. I will never let those who harmed her walk free. His mother reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. Justice is necessary, son. But don't let anger consume your heart. Build your life with her not on revenge, but on love. James sat quietly, staring at the flame, his mind torn between duty and tenderness. I'll balance both. She deserves peace, and justice is the only way she'll truly have it. Weeks later, the wooden house stood complete. Surrounded by young saplings of mango and cinnamon trees, it gleamed under the sunlight like a symbol of rebirth. Villagers stopped to admire it, whispering about how James had poured his heart into building something not for himself, but for the woman he loved. On the day Diep moved in, James held her hand as they crossed the threshold together. Her steps were slow, cautious, as though afraid the ground might give way. But as she entered the living space, a soft smile bloomed across her face. It feels like home, she said, her voice almost a whisper. James's chest tightened, his heart overflowing. That's exactly what I wanted you to feel. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering like a chorus of blessings. For James, this house was more than a building. It was a vow carved in wood and stone, a promise of marriage, of family, of a future that neither betrayal nor sorrow could destroy. But even as Diep settled into her new home, forgiveness in her heart, James's mind remained resolute. He had already taken steps to ensure that Trang's father would be brought before the law. There would be no escape, no shadow to hide behind. For Diep, peace came through forgiveness. For James, it came through justice. And together, though their paths of healing were different, they found unity in love. As night fell on the wooden house, James stood at the doorway, watching Diep arrange simple flowers in a vase. The soft glow of lantern light framed her figure, serene and calm. He whispered to himself, a vow only the stars could hear. This is our beginning. I'll protect her, I'll love her, and one day soon, she'll be my wife. The house creaked softly in the night breeze, like an answer, like a blessing. And so, in the quiet countryside, beneath the endless sky, James and Diep stepped into a new chapter, one where love stood strong, forgiveness found its place, and justice waited patiently to balance the scales. Their story was far from over, but in that moment, wrapped in the warmth of their wooden home, the future finally felt within reach.